So today, this morning, how many of you were here today? A few of you I know I've seen around. Well, I spoke this morning about the great tradition, and it was more of an overview lecture than anything else. Tonight, I want to focus in on one particular person, St. Augustine, who in some ways stands at the fountainhead of the great tradition and certainly shaped it and contributed to it in profound ways that affect us all still today. His name was Aurelius Augustinus. He was the Bishop of Hippo. He was a doctor of the church. That's an official title. And he's what I call a pilgrim for an ecotonic age. Now, that's a big fancy word. Maybe you know it, maybe you don't. Ecotone. What is an ecotone? The word ecotone, E-C-O-T-O-N-E, for those of you who are taking notes, was coined way back in 1859 by a British biologist and geographer named Alfred Russel Wallace. And an ecotone refers to a space where two or more ecospheres meet and merge, where the mountains meet the plains, or where the drift of the river encounters the current of the sea. As I say down in South Carolina, the Ashley and the Cooper rivers join together to form the Atlantic Ocean. That's an ecotone, where two or more ecosystems come and merge together. If you're flying out west, often you fly for miles, it seems, for hours, it seems, over the plains, the cornfields of Nebraska and Kansas and all of that. And then there in the distance, if you're looking ahead, you can see the rise of the Rocky Mountains coming, it seems, out of nowhere up into the sky. That's an ecotone, where the mountains meet the plain. Now, there's something about an ecotone that it's a place of great danger. It's also a place of great fluidity, of biodiversity, of generativity. There's a lot of stuff happening in an ecotone. It's a place of great danger, yes, of risk and uncertainty, but they are also at the same time places of great capacity, where things are happening, where new life is emerging. Now, if we can extrapolate for a minute from this world I've been talking about, the world of geography, of ecology, and think for a minute about the world of history. Well, St. Augustine lived in one of the great ecotonic moments in the unfolding of Western consciousness. For he witnessed, on the one hand, the death throes of a fading past age. We call it classical antiquity. And on the other hand, he witnessed the birth pangs of a new age, which we look back and call the Middle Ages. At that intersection of two vast moments in human history, Augustine arose as a voice for the gospel, as a voice for Jesus Christ, as an evangelist, as a pastor, as a bishop of the church, and as a theologian of the church. Hans von Kampenhausen was a great German theologian of some years ago. He once said that Augustine is the only church father who even today, all these many years later, still remains an intellectual power. Now, some of us may want to argue with him. What about Origen? What about Athanasius? What about Irenaeus? We can think of some other great luminary theological voices. But can you think of anybody that surpasses Augustine? I don't think so. But we can even go further, I think, than Hans von Kampenhausen to say that outside of the inspired authors of Holy Scripture, no one in the history of Christianity has thought more deeply about the things that matter most ultimately than St. Augustine. And for that reason, he's worthy of our close attention. Well, Alfred North Whitehead was a 20th century philosopher who famously argued that the whole history of Western thought can be read, as he said, as a series of footnotes to Plato. Well, likewise, the history of Christian thought can be read as a series of footnotes to St. Augustine, especially if we limit our gaze to the history of Christian thought in the West. In the East, there's a somewhat less enthusiastic embrace of St. Augustine. Go to the 16th century. That's where most of us take our bearings when we think about these things. We are Reformational Christians. We are Protestants. We are evangelicals. Well, the debates surrounding the Reformation of the 16th century were not so much, I contend, about who understood the Bible better, but rather who got Augustine right. Because everybody wanted to claim him as their own. Martin Luther, let us not forget, was himself an Augustinian monk. That was the religious order to which he belonged before he had his turnaround moment of conversion, however we describe that. Or Calvin. Calvin was not a monk of any order, but Calvin was a great reader, of course, of the Bible, but also of the history of the church, and especially the early church, and most especially St. Augustine. There are more than 2,000 quotations from St. Augustine in the Institutes of the Christian Religion by John Calvin, more than any other non-biblical source. Now, what about today? Well, over the past 100 years, there's been a remarkable renaissance in Augustinian studies, not only among theologians and religious thinkers, but also among psychologists, philosophers, postmodernists of every stripe. For example, Martin Heidegger lectured on Augustine's Confessions prior to the publication of his great magnum opus called Being and Time, which came out in 1927. Before that, he had already been lecturing on the Confessions of St. Augustine. Or take another figure, not from Germany, but from France, Albert Camus. Maybe some of you have read of his works, one of the great founding voices of existentialism in the 20th century. Albert Camus was born in the country of Algeria, where Augustine was also born. It's the country Augustine called home. And Camus wrote his doctoral dissertation called Christian Metaphysics and Neoplatonism, focused on St. Augustine. Just one more example from recent times of the impact of Augustine. And this is Hannah Arendt. Hannah Arendt was a brilliant philosopher and a refugee from Nazi Germany, later became the president of the University of Chicago in our country. And she also wrote her dissertation on St. Augustine, a fascinating work entitled Love and St. Augustine. So his influence is deep and wide and permeating even to our present time. But it's not only great scholars and literateurs and people like I've just mentioned, Heidegger and Camus and Hannah Arendt, but it's also an influence that cuts across class, religion, race, ethnic, political, generational divides. Why is that? Why can you go to a bookstore? Do you still have bookstores in this part of the world? They're about all gone from where I live. But if you still have any bookstores that you can visit, then you're likely to find some books by St. Augustine there and others about St. Augustine there, where you'll find very, very few of anybody else representing the Christian tradition. Why is that? I have an idea. Just a thought. Maybe it is partly because Augustine himself did not fit easily into any well-established social niches of his time. He was a provincial born in Algeria, in the sticks, we might say, way apart from the great centers of influence and power, in a small town called Tagaste in North Africa. His father, Patricius, or if you want to say it in Latin, as he no doubt said it, Patricius, was a minor bureaucratic official whose job was to collect taxes. You remember Zacchaeus in the New Testament? He was a tax collector too, who tried to see Jesus and climbed up into the sycamore tree. Well, Patricius was not at the very lowest rungs of the social order. He owned some property, but he faced the threat of bankruptcy and poverty, and there was always a possibility that his family could be set upon by hoodlums and gangs, because in those days, if you were a tax collector and the people you were supposed to collect taxes from didn't pay, as happened sometimes back then and still happens today, I'm told, then you had to pay, which meant that you were likely constantly in debt. And so that was the case with Augustine's father, Patricius. When he was 16 years old, Augustine had to be taken out of school, although his parents had shown great prescience in sending him to school and teaching him Latin and giving him the best start in education they could, because they saw the advantage of it even back then. But when he was 16 years old, the money ran out. Some neighbors who owed tax money to his father didn't pay, and Augustine had to be taken out of school because there was no money to pay for it. Well, what about his mom, his mother? Well, we actually know quite a bit more about his mother than we do his father. His mother was named Monica, and she, unlike his father was not a Christian. On his deathbed, he made a profession of faith, but most of his life he had no interest in the things of the faith, but not so with Monica. Monica was a devout Christian, and she came from a Berber stock. What are the Berbers? The Berbers was an ethnic group from inside, closer into the heartland of Africa, nearer to sub-Saharan Africa, we say today. And there's great evidence, I think, that Augustine himself was of a mixed breed. We know that partly because of the nicknames his enemies said against him. One of Augustine's chief theological opponents was a man named Julian of Ecotonic, and he used numerous racial slurs when speaking of Augustine. This African, he would call him, or the hard-headed Numidian. Numidia was that region of Africa where he was from. Or one time, the Punic polemicist. Those were ways of casting racial slurs at his theological opponent, Augustine. Now, if you want to know how Augustine plays today for students, say just college students, university students, seminary students, anybody who's studying and picks up Augustine, I suggest that you look at a new, fairly new, couple of years ago, book that came out by Jamie Smith, a delightful little book called On the Road with St. Augustine, a real-world spirituality for restless hearts. That's a great title. A real-world spirituality for restless hearts. Jamie Smith reads Augustine as a philosopher of experience, as a phenomenologist, with Heidegger and Hannah Arendt and Derrida and Camus all looking over his shoulder to be sure he gets it right. Augustine is our contemporary. He has directly and indirectly shaped the way we understand our pursuits today. A modern term, I think that fits him very well, authenticity. In some ways, Augustine has put us on the road we're on. And it's one reason why he continues to fascinate, Jamie Smith says in his little book, On the Road with St. Augustine. And he points out something, that this highway that starts, I think, at St. Louis or somewhere and goes west, wiggles west all the way to the California Pacific coast, Route 66. Have you heard of it? There used to be a TV program called Route 66. You know where it ends? Santa Monica. That's the mother of St. Augustine. It ends where Augustine began, with Santa Monica. Now, Augustine shapes the great tradition of Christian learning, which I talked about this morning a little bit. The great tradition of Christian learning and Christian believing. And he does this not only by his many voluminous writings and theological formulations hammered out in controversy, but also, this is a point I want to elaborate on a little bit, he shapes the great tradition not only by what he wrote about many different topics and themes and controversies and debates, but also by how he lived. His efforts to go beneath the surface, to explore the deep caverns of human consciousness, to not settle with being shallow. My great friend J.I. Packer, who's now with the Lord, used to say American evangelicalism is 3,000 miles wide and 1 inch deep. I'm afraid he's too right in that comment. Augustine is a corrective to shallowness. He wants us to go beneath the surface, to explore the deep caverns of human consciousness, even to what we call today the subconscious. His authenticity, there's that word again, his transparency, both with himself and with God, make him a master of wisdom from whom I think we still have very much to learn. Those of us within the church who know something about him already, and the many others who are yet to learn. Now, of the many themes that we could talk about with St. Augustine, I know my time is limited, and so I want to focus on what I think is one of the most important, if not the most important theme in all of his many, many writings. And it's the Latin word peregrinatio, pilgrimage. Augustine did not coin that word. He didn't invent that word, but he used it often. It was one of his favorite words and became the chosen motif of his entire spiritual life. You see that if you just open the Confessions, book 1, chapter 1, first paragraph, first sentence almost, you find these words. I'll read from a fairly new translation of the Confessions. One of the great things about the Confessions, this is just a side note, almost every other month there seems to come out a new translation of the Confessions, which is wonderful. It's kind of like the Bible. You've got your choice all the way from the King James Version to the most modern hipster version of the Bible. Well, it's the same kind of thing with St. Augustine. If you want to know, let me mention my favorite translation of the Confession. And this is personal. You know, there's some things you like better than others. And this is a translation. It's been around for a while. It's not the most recent, but I think it's one of the best. It's by a British author. I don't know a whole lot about him. I think he was a Roman Catholic. He was born in 1917, educated at Cambridge. His name was R.S. Pine Coffin. Isn't that a funny name? Pine-Coffin. And he translated St. Augustine's Confessions from the Latin, and it's the one that I most frequently turn to. But there's so many others. Another great translation, those of you that are interested in pursuing this more, is Henry Chadwick. Henry Chadwick, one of the great Augustine scholars of our time, died just a few years ago. But the one I want to quote from now, the opening lines of the Confessions, is by Sarah Ruden. Sarah Ruden, R-U-D-E-N, was a classical scholar. That's her background, and a translator, a poet. And so there's something of a poetic quality about her translation of Augustine's Confessions. And she opens that book 1, chapter 1 of the Confessions this way. You made us with yourself as our goal, and our heart is restless until it rests in you. You made us with yourself as our goal. One reason I like that way of putting it, you have made us for yourself. Our hearts are restless until they find their rest in you. Maybe you're more familiar with that translation. It points to the fact that we are teleological people, we human beings. We're not just meant to wander aimlessly around and around and around, but we were built with a kind of inbuilt purpose in mind, a goal, a telos in Greek. And of course, that telos, we find out, is the very one who made us. Our heart is restless until it rests with you, for you have made us with yourself as our goal. Nothing less than yourself. Or you go all the way to the very end of Augustine's City of God, this enormous magnum opus that he spent probably the last 20 more years of his life writing. I'll say a little more about that in a few minutes, but when you come to the very end of the City of God, it takes a while to get there. I mean, it's a big book. Augustine is describing the felicity of the eternal city, John Bunyan's celestial city, heaven, at home with God. And this is how Augustine describes it. There we shall be, and there we shall be still and see. There we shall see and we shall love. We shall love and we shall praise. Behold, what will be in the end without end. For what is our end but to reach that kingdom which has no end? What a succinct, powerful expression of eternity with God. We're on the road to that destination. That's our telos. We're not there yet. We still have a ways to go. So pilgrimage is one of these great themes that courses through all of Augustine's writings. Now, in the ancient world, there were two primary paradigms for pilgrimage. First, there was the story of Odysseus, as told in Homer's epic poem, the Odyssey. Now, Augustine knew Latin extremely well, like you know your own mother tongue. He was that good at Latin. That was his mother tongue, well, one of his mother tongues. Probably Berber was the other one. But he didn't know Greek very well. He tells us this. He confesses it. He struggled with Greek. He's not the only one who struggled with Greek. Other people have too, but he struggled with Greek. But he knew about this Greek myth, the Odysseus, not from reading it in Greek from Homer. His Greek wasn't that good, but from reading it in Latin as Virgil, the great Roman epic poet, retold it in his masterpiece called the Aeneid. If any of you have studied Latin in high school or college, you may have read the Aeneid. It was one of the first books I ever read in Latin. And it tells the story of Odysseus, who set out one time from his hometown called Ithaca, leaving behind his wife, whose name was Penelope, and their son, whose name was Telemachus. And for 9 long years, Odysseus wanders over the face of the earth through many dangerous adventures, often at sea, sometimes shipwrecked, caught in peril at sea and on land. He survives the Trojan War, always, though, intending to return to his home, to go back where he had started. That's the classical motif of pilgrimage, which Augustine knew well. I say it's classical because it also matches the Neoplatonic myth of the return of the soul. This idea that in the previous life, before creation in this world, there was a disruption in the heavenly places, and the soul itself was lost from its original vision. And the whole meaning and quest of human life, according to this Greek myth as told by Odysseus, by Virgil, and before him by Homer, was to get the soul back into harmony with that primordial, supernal truth and beauty that was there before the disruption, before the fall came. Well, he knew that story. Everybody knew that story who had any smattering of education in the classics because it was everywhere. You even find it in the Gnostic myth that we encounter in some of the early church fathers like Irenaeus, who refutes it. But there is another story of pilgrimage, not the one of Odysseus who is shipwrecked in the sea and tries to get home and struggles, but another motif that's not from Homer. It's not from the Greek classics. Rather, it's from the Bible. It's the story of Abraham and Sarah. You know, Abraham was well settled in his hometown of Ur in Chaldea when one day, in the midst of everything that was familiar, he felt strangely out of place, not at home. Somehow a call came to him and Sarah from beyond themselves. Now, how did the call come? You know, we don't know because the Bible doesn't tell us. Was it like Moses, who heard God speak to him from a burning bush? Or was it like Elijah on the mount, the still small voice? How did that call come to Abraham and Sarah? Well, we don't know, but however it came, they heard it, they understood it, and they responded to it. And it inaugurated a pilgrimage for them. They gathered their family, all their belongings, and they set out to a place where they've never been before. And the writer of Hebrews says, that wonderful passage in Hebrews 11, they went out not knowing where they were going. Not knowing where they were going. It was a move, we could say, from certainty into trust. Back in Ur of the Chaldees, their hometown, they were somebody. They had a lot of property. They had servants. They had all kinds of things at their disposal. They had status. They were somebody. But now they're called in some strange, mysterious way. We're not completely given to know why or how. They are called to leave all of that behind and to set out on a journey, on a pilgrimage from certainty into trust, from security into vulnerability. Because back in Ur of Chaldea, they had great lands, no doubt homes, palaces, maybe we would say. But now they're called to leave all of that behind and become what? Nomads. Nomads are people without houses and lands and places to call their own. They're the ones who live in tents, like the Bedouin in the Middle East, who pick up their tents and move from one place to another. Vulnerability, that's part of the pilgrimage that Abraham and Sarah were called to go on. Now, Augustine understands the call of God more like Abraham and Sarah responding to this divine summons than the old epic of Homer and Odysseus, who go on a quest, undefined and indefinite. Now, this has been hard for Augustine scholars to take on board. Even though we all know it, it's been hard for us to really appropriate, because there is a kind of understanding of Augustine that stands over against the one I'm presenting tonight. One of my teachers, one of my very fine teachers at Harvard, was a man named Christopher Stendhal. He was a New Testament scholar, but he wrote an article published in 1962 called St. Augustine and the Introspective Conscience of the West, in which he interpreted Augustine's approach to faith as the result of a turn inward, a quest for his true self. He stands at the headwaters, Christopher Stendhal said, of that introspective conscience that becomes so dominant in our Western versions of identity. I think more has been written about Augustine and the self than anything else, unless it's Augustine and sex. There's a lot written about that too. The self. But for Augustine, the self is not a thing to be discovered by gazing deep within, by introspectively turning to yourself. You know, there's no word for self in Latin. There's not. You have to go to something like the word ipse, I-P-S-E, which is an intensive pronoun, or sui, which is a reflexive pronoun. There is no word for self in Latin. The closest you could come in Augustine is his phrase, homo intensius, which you could translate a person inside, the internal person. Well, this quest for the self will, in the end, be a dead end. It will not lead to where we're seeking. And that's the source, of course, of so much misery and sadness and disruption in our world today. You have made us for yourself, O Lord, and our hearts are restless, not until they turn and look at themselves and find their true self deep within. That's the psychological paradigm. But until they find their rest in you, in thee. 1,400 years after Augustine wrote the Confessions, another book with that same title was published by Jean-Jacques Rousseau. You know that name, a philosopher at the cusp of the Enlightenment. And his book, Confessions, is a deliberate counterpoint to Augustine. Rousseau wants to find the true self by paring away the layers of tradition, including all the sacred texts like the Bible, and the doctrines and the creeds of the Christian faith, what I talked about this morning as the great tradition. He wants to do away with that. It stands in the way. Sweep it away. For Augustine, though, the self is more elusive than it was for Rousseau and those Enlightenment thinkers who followed in his train. For Augustine, the self is never at its own disposal. I'll say that again. The self is never at its own disposal. It's not that you can just pare away these layers and discover the jewel within. How do we discover who we are under God? Most often, I contend, it is not by introspection. It is not by psychological self-examination or even psychoanalysis. Most often, it is through the experiences of dislocation and loss. You know, sometimes people ask me, how do you talk about becoming a Christian to somebody who shows no interest, who's hardened against it? Well, you do the best you can. You do all you can to give a reason for the hope that you have within, 1 Peter 3:15. But at the end of the day, very often, it's only in an experience of dislocation. When the doctor comes into the waiting room and takes you by the hand and says, you know, there's nothing else we can do. We've done all we can. And suddenly you're brought up short and you realize that your life is not in your hands. In a situation of loss, when you've lost a loved one, or dislocation, you've lost everything you own. In such a moment, there is an openness and a readiness to hear the good news of the gospel, but not often until then is my experience as a pastor and a counselor. Look at the prodigal son. That was one of Augustine's favorite texts in the Bible. He preached on it often. He gave sermons and commentaries on it. Well, we all know the story. The prodigal son leaves the father's house. He goes into the far country and he wastes everything he has. In the King James Version says riotous living, thinking he's having a good time, but he ends up in misery. And then there comes the turning point. And what is the turning point? The turning point are those little lines in the King James Version. He came to himself. He came to himself. In that moment of dislocation, he's away from home, he's lost all of his money, he has no friends, no one to turn to. In that moment of dislocation and loss, he came to himself. And he makes the resolution, I will arise. I will go home to my father. I will throw myself on his mercy. Or Old Testament Psalm 130, one of the great, great Psalms. You shouldn't say that about the Psalms. All of them are great. But, this one is a big mountain peak. Psalm 130, one of the great Psalms on prayer in all of the Bible. It begins this way. Out of the depths have I called unto thee, O Lord. O Lord, hear my prayer. Well, Augustine dug as deeply as he could into the innermost part of his conscious, his subconscious. But at the end of the day, it's only when he comes to the end of his rope that he's able to turn away from himself and back to the God who made him, back to the God who was calling him to know him and to love him. And so we pay attention to ourselves in a proper, life-giving way when we bring our lives, our thoughts, our imagination, our daydreams, and our nightmares, all of them, coram Deo, into the very presence of the living God who made us with himself as our goal, as Sarah Rudin translated that first line. The goal of the contemplative life. What is it? It is, as Paul says in 1 Corinthians 13, that we might see God facie ad faciem, face to face. Even though in this life we inwardly see through a glass darkly. The Greek word there is enigma. It may not be a bad English translation of that word. Then we shall see face to face. And along the way, there are glimpses that we have that turn us from time to time away from ourselves, away from the world around us and beneath us and above us, to the one who made us. And we can get glimpses of it. Here's one of my favorite passages from the Confessions. This is from chapter 10, paragraph 7. But what do I love when I love my God? Augustine asked that question. What do I love when I love my God? Not material beauty or the beauty of a temporal order, not the brilliance of earthly light so welcome to our eyes, not the sweet melody of harmony and song, not the fragrance of flowers and perfumes and spices, not manna or honey, not limbs as the body delights to embrace. It is not these that I love when I love my God. And yet, when I love him, it is true that I love a light of a certain kind, a voice, a perfume, a food, an embrace. But they are of the kind that I love in my inner self, when my soul is bathed in light that is not bound by space, when it listens to sounds that never die away, when it breathes fragrance that is not borne away by the wind, when it tastes food that is never consumed by the eating, when it clings to an embrace which is not severed by the fulfillment of desire. That is what I love when I love my God, which is another way of saying that God has made you not to be terminated with the material things of this world, however beautiful and wondrous they may be, but they are pointers toward that reality which has no ending, where you bask forever in the eternal light and love of God. Well, how is this perspective related to Augustine's conversion? I don't have time to develop this part of the lecture, but let me tell you, I think we make a mistake sometimes when we focus so much on conversion as a punctiliar experience, as a one-moment time. Now, I had a personal conversion like that. I know what that means when I was 11 years old, and that changed my life forever. I'll never deny that. But that was not the end of conversion. Conversion continues as a process of, that's what the word means, turning, a turning to God. And this is what brings us finally, ultimately, to that telos, that purpose that we have in life. That's how Augustine got started on his pilgrimage toward God. It was by reading an old Roman philosopher named Cicero, a work that has since been lost to us, lost to the whole world, lost in antiquity. We no longer have it, but we have a quotation from it that Augustine gives us in the Confessions. He came across this line in Cicero's treatise Hortensius, that there is a telos, there's that word goal again, a telos, a meaning, a purpose, beyond riches, beyond fame, beyond pleasure. And he suddenly realized, he was maybe 18 or 19 years old when he had this experience. The end of his teenage years, just the beginning of young adulthood. He realized there had to be something more than all that he was experiencing in the things of this world. More than gold, more than glamour, more than glands. There had to be something more. And this led him on a quest, on a search to find that more, that pilgrimage to his true heavenly home. Now, if you've read the Confessions, I hope you have. If not, this would be a good opportunity for me to encourage you to do so, to bury yourself in them. And if you get stranded on a desert island, take a good translation with you, Pine Coffin or somebody else, and read it and reread it, and it'll boil down into the very essence of your soul. But he went from one religion to another, from one philosophy to another. He starts out as a disciple of Cicero. He next turns to Manichaeism. Manichaeism was a religion of dualism, light and darkness, good and evil, two co-eternal realms, and it was enormously popular in Augustine's day. He was caught up into it for about 9 years. Why was it so popular? This absolute dichotomy between good and evil, light and darkness, God and the devil. Well, I think one reason it was so popular is that it had something of the mystique of the East. Zoroastrianism was the name it was given years ago when it arose. And it keeps coming back. It's expressive, it's enchanting, it's syncretistic. You don't have to just follow Jesus. You can follow lots of different ways in God's, and they'll all help you on the way. When I was a student many years ago at Harvard Divinity School, our class was brought together one day by our professor, Harvey Cox, who took us into what's called the Brown Room, this big, beautiful room that paintings on the wall, and he had us stand together in a circle and hold hands. He said, I'm going to teach you now what true worship is like in the East. He had just written a book called Turning East, and he was trying to get us into the feeling of mysticism. And he had us stand together in a circle and hold hands and emit a primal scream. I'll never forget that. I wondered about those Puritan fathers of Harvard looking down upon us little Master of Divinity students screaming primally in the Brown Room. But it was the attraction, the lure, the feeling of this religion, which was exotic and yet at the same time alluring, attracting us more and more into it. He leaves that behind, and he next turns to something that we're all very familiar with today. Maybe some of you have been through this kind of phase in your own life. We use a word that was invented in the 19th century to describe it, agnosticism. That's a new word, 19th century word. Before then, nobody ever used that word. But the reality was still there. Augustine experienced agnosticism. This is a view that says there is no absolute truth. There is no ultimate right or wrong. We just don't know. And for a while, he wallowed in the semi-believable credibility of something like that until one day he realized If there is no absolute right or wrong that we can know about at all, if we're just left in agnostic soup, then how do we know that there's no absolute truth? It's self-defeating. It's a vicious circle. So next he turns to Neoplatonism. And a great deal of what he writes about in the Confessions leading up to his famous encounter in the garden at Milan is wrestling with this model of transcendence, Neoplatonism, a philosophy that comes from Plato. And it did one very good thing for him. It caused Augustine to realize there has to be something beyond this life. There has to be something that gives you a transcendent view of reality beyond what you can see, feel, think, and experience in this life. But there were problems with Neoplatonism when you read it alongside the scriptures. And the problem had to do really with two issues. One was creation, the other one was history. The Bible says that God created the heavens and the earth. Out of nothing, ex nihilo, God created everything that is. Well, Plato didn't believe in that. He thought there'd always been some primordial stuff that had been around, and God was just reshaping it in some kind of way. So creation was a corrective to his Neoplatonism. He couldn't hold on to it and believe what the scriptures taught about God the Creator. The other thing was history. According to Plato, history is a cycle that returns around and round and round, going on ad infinitum forever and ever. But of course, the Bible teaches that history has been bisected in a decisive way by the incursion of God himself into our lives and into our world. That's the incarnation, John 1:14. The Word was made flesh and dwelt among us. So he moves beyond Neoplatonism and finally comes ultimately to that moment of surrender in the garden outside of his home in Milan, where he turns in faith to Jesus Christ and humbly accepts the truth of the gospel. This was a work of God in his life. He wasn't led to that point by thinking through all of the implications of it and somehow coming to a rational conclusion based on all of the evidence that could be marshaled. He had all of that, but it took something more to bring him to the moment of surrender. It took this coming to the end of his rope and realizing that God is offering to meet him where his greatest need is, and that is in the moment of surrender. So for Augustine, conversion in this sense, even though there was this punctiliar moment in the garden, read about that in Book 8 of the Confessions, it was really a lifelong process of turning, being turned from himself to the soul. Turn from self to soul. If I could summarize Augustine's journey in one phrase, that would probably be it. It was a pilgrimage from self to soul, from self-sufficiency and self-aggrandizement to self-expenditure. It's what Jesus said. You want to save your life? Lose it. You want to gain something? Let go. From pride to humility. From security to vulnerability, like Abraham and Sarah. Let this mind be in you that was also in Christ Jesus, who, though he was truly divine, did not cling to the advantages of status, but humbled himself and became obedient unto death, even the death of the cross. Let me quote from Eugene Peterson's translation of the New Testament called The Message. This is from that passage in Philippians 2 I was just quoting. Let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ. If you've gotten anything at all out of following Christ, this is Peterson's rendering of it. If his love has made any difference in your life, if being in a community of the Spirit means anything to you, if you have a heart, If you care, then do me a favor. Agree with each other. Love each other. Be deep-spirited friends. Don't push your way to the front. Don't sweet talk your way to the top. Put yourself aside and help others get ahead. Don't be obsessed by getting your own advantage. Forget yourselves long enough to lend a helping hand to others. So love one another. Be deep-spirited friends. Think of yourself the way Christ Jesus thought of himself. He who was in the form of God and was God, morphe theou in Greek, in the very shape and form and fashion of God, made himself of ill repute and was made a slave and subjected him to obedience, the obedience that led to the cross. Well, Augustine does not recommend that you turn your gaze within, searching for an elusive self. But instead, he recommends that we turn our gaze, the gaze of our mind's eye, not to ourselves, but to two other places. First of all, and most importantly, to the wounds of the one who died on the cross for our sins. That we behold there what the New Testament calls the nail prints, the stigmata in the flesh of Jesus Christ. And even though he is risen now in heaven, ascended at the right hand of God the Father, he still bears in his ascended, resurrected flesh those marks of his passion, the nail prints. That's where you want to look. Not to yourself, but to Christ. For if you look to those wounds of Jesus, the crucified, risen one, you will see there also the wounds of your fellow pilgrims, those who are on the road with you, including the poor, the needy, the hungry, the thirsty, the ill-clad, the sick, the prisoners, all of whom are image bearers of God, worthy of our respect and of our love. Our fellow pilgrims, with whom and through whom we see the world through the eyes of the Savior's love. And it's that kind of vision of Christ that can change your life. It's that kind of vision of the risen, crucified Christ and the wounds of your fellow pilgrims that points you toward the one who calls you eternally to himself. For he has made you for himself, and your hearts will forever be restless until they find their rest, the rest for which they were made in him. Thank you very much.